It is November 1494. In the heart of the Ottoman Empire, the world turns its gaze toward two men whose reigns would mark the rise and fall of empires: Suleiman the Magnificent of the Ottoman Empire and Aisin Gioro Puyi of China. Each carried the weight of dynasties and shifting traditions, navigating reform, authority, and personal trials at the edge of history's great transformations. Let us begin with the first, Suleiman the Magnificent. Suleiman the Magnificent was born on the 6th of November in the year 1494 in the city of Trabzon on the southern coast of the Black Sea, part of the Ottoman Empire. What kind of man would rise from the distant edges of an empire to become its greatest ruler? How did this boy from Trabzon grow into the sultan who redefined law, expanded borders, and sparked a golden age of culture? What shaped the heart of a man called both the Magnificent and the Lawgiver? Suleiman was born into imperial lineage as the only son of Prince Selim, who would later become Selim I, and his consort Hafsa Sultan. His birth came at a time when the Ottoman Empire stood on the cusp of immense transformation. From an early age, Suleiman was surrounded by the richness of court life, but his world was also steeped in the responsibilities and expectations that came with being a prince of a growing empire. His formative years were spent in the imperial palace, where he received rigorous training in statecraft, religion, and the arts of war. These early foundations would mold him into a ruler destined to reshape history. From the moment young Suleiman entered the world of the Ottoman court, his path was carefully shaped by tradition, ambition, and preparation. At just 7 years old, he began his formal education in the Topkapi Palace, the grand heart of the Ottoman capital, Constantinople. Here, surrounded by scholars, generals, and administrators, he absorbed the lessons that would one day guide an empire. His studies were intense and wide-ranging. Suleiman was taught religion and theology, grounding him deeply in Sunni Islam. He learned literature, calligraphy, and history, gaining a sense of the Ottoman legacy and Islamic traditions. Military tactics and strategy were also central to his training, as warfare remained the empire's lifeblood. The balance between intellect and action became a defining feature of his early growth. One figure played a significant role in his youth, a young Greek slave named Ibrahim, who would become Suleiman's closest companion and later his powerful Grand Vizier. Their friendship began in childhood and would later evolve into one of the most influential political partnerships of the age. The bond formed in these early palace days would eventually shake the entire court. As Suleiman grew, he was given increasingly serious responsibilities. By the age of 17, he had already served as governor in several provinces, including Kaffa, Manasa, and Edirne. These early appointments were more than ceremonial. They gave him real experience in administration, diplomacy, and managing local conflicts, all under the watchful eye of his father, Selim I. The palace was not only a place of learning, but a crucible of ambition. And from that crucible, Suleiman emerged as a young prince ready to claim the world. In the year 1520, a shift occurred that would change the destiny of an empire. Upon the death of his father, Selim I, the 25-year-old Suleiman left his post and made his way to Constantinople, the imperial capital. There, he was proclaimed the 10th Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, a vast domain that stretched across 3 continents. The moment was heavy with expectation. Selim I had expanded the empire with speed and brutality. His reign, though brief, had made the Ottoman sultans caliphs of the Islamic world. Now, eyes turned to his only son. Could Suleiman hold together what had been conquered? Could he lead with the same force, or perhaps with something entirely new? Contemporary envoys described the new sultan as tall and slender, with sharp eyes and a thoughtful nature. He was said to be kind yet firm, scholarly yet commanding. These first impressions would soon prove accurate. From his very first days in power, Suleiman showed a taste for bold decisions. He reappointed trusted officials, elevated loyal advisors, and began laying plans for military campaigns that would expand the empire's borders even further. But beyond conquest, he had something more ambitious in mind, a vision of justice, art, and enduring legacy. In the quiet halls of Topkapi Palace, the young sultan set about his work with determination. He was not content to merely inherit power. He would transform it. His accession was not just the beginning of a reign. It was the opening chapter in the most glorious era the Ottoman Empire would ever know. With the crown firmly upon his head, Suleiman wasted no time in proving his strength. Just 1 year after his accession, he launched his first major campaign, a bold strike against the fortress city of Belgrade, long seen as a gateway to Europe. This was no ordinary conquest. Belgrade had withstood the might of previous sultans, including Suleiman's great-grandfather, Mehmed the Conqueror. Now, in the summer of 1521, Suleiman was determined to succeed where others had failed. Leading an army of over 250,000 soldiers, he laid siege to the city. Belgrade's defenders, though brave, were overwhelmed. After heavy bombardments and strategic assaults, the fortress fell. Its capture sent shockwaves through Christendom and signaled a new era of Ottoman expansion. But Suleiman's ambition did not stop there. His eyes turned south to the eastern Mediterranean, where the island of Rhodes stood defiant. The island was held by the Knights of St. John, a Christian military order with a long history of resisting Islamic powers. In 1522, Suleiman personally led a massive force in a brutal 5-month siege of Rhodes. The defenders fought valiantly, but in the end, they surrendered. Suleiman, in a gesture of calculated mercy, allowed the knights to leave unharmed, a move that earned him both fear and respect across Europe. These twin victories, Belgrade and Rhodes, announced Suleiman not only as a capable ruler, but as a formidable military commander. In just 2 years, he had already carved his name into the walls of history. In the year 1526, Suleiman once again set his sights on Europe. This time, his target was the powerful Kingdom of Hungary, a key stronghold between the Ottoman Empire and the heart of the continent. Tensions had been building for years, and now, with the death of a Hungarian king and a divided nobility, Suleiman saw his opportunity. He led a massive army northward, crossing rivers and plains with purpose. On the 29th of August, his forces met the Hungarian army near the town of Mohacs. The Hungarian nobles, eager for glory, launched a premature attack. What followed was a masterclass in Ottoman military strategy. Suleiman's troops, well coordinated and deeply disciplined, executed a series of calculated counterattacks. Within hours, the Hungarian lines collapsed. King Louis II was thrown from his horse while fleeing and drowned in a nearby stream. Most of his nobility perished with him. The victory was complete and devastating. With a single battle, the centuries-old kingdom crumbled. Hungary was split, part falling under Ottoman rule, part under the Habsburgs, and part becoming the semi-independent Principality of Transylvania. It was a moment that shook the political order of Central Europe. As Suleiman stood over the field of battle, he reportedly mourned the young king, saying, "It was not my wish that he should be thus cut off before he scarcely tasted the sweets of life and royalty." These words, whether poetic or sincere, reflected the Sultan's awareness of the gravity of his triumph. The fall of Mohacs was not just a victory, it was the dismantling of a kingdom. Fresh from his victory at Mohacs, Suleiman turned his gaze toward an even greater prize, the city of Vienna. For centuries, Vienna had stood as the heart of Central Europe, a fortress of Habsburg power and a symbol of Christian resistance. In the autumn of 1529, Suleiman led his forces toward the city in what would become the most daring military expedition of his reign. His army was vast and experienced. As they marched through the Danube Valley, city after city fell before them. Suleiman reclaimed Buda and advanced toward the gates of Vienna, determined to strike fear into the heart of Europe. It was a moment of incredible momentum. The Ottomans seemed unstoppable. But as the siege began, nature and fortune turned against them. Torrential rains battered the soldiers. Their massive siege equipment became stuck in mud or lost along broken roads. Supplies ran low, and the defenders of Vienna, though outnumbered, held firm behind strong walls and with fierce resistance. After just over 2 weeks of unsuccessful siege, Suleiman was forced to retreat. The failure to capture Vienna marked the first major setback of his rule. Though the campaign did not destroy his reputation, it set the boundaries of Ottoman expansion into Europe. Still, this defeat sparked a rivalry that would shape European politics for centuries, the fierce struggle between the Ottomans and the Habsburgs. For Suleiman, Vienna was a missed crown, a dream denied. Yet even in retreat, he remained the sultan who had brought his empire farther west than any before him, and whose shadow lingered over Europe long after his army withdrew. While Suleiman's western campaigns caught the attention of Europe, another powerful rival waited in the east, the Safavid Empire of Persia. Led by Shah Tahmasp, the Safavids represented a different branch of Islam and a constant threat to Ottoman dominance in the region. Unlike the Christian kingdoms of Europe, this was a religious and territorial rivalry that struck at the heart of Islamic leadership. Tensions escalated in the early 1530s when the Safavid ruler killed the Ottoman-appointed governor of Baghdad and replaced him with his own man. This direct challenge could not go unanswered. Suleiman dispatched his trusted Grand Vizier, Ibrahim Pasha, to lead an army into eastern Anatolia. The response was swift. The Ottomans reclaimed lost cities, including Bitlis and Tabriz, with minimal resistance. In 1534, Suleiman himself joined the campaign, marching deep into Mesopotamia. The journey was brutal, marked by harsh terrain and guerrilla tactics from Persian forces. But the rewards were great. Suleiman made a grand entrance into Baghdad, where he ordered the restoration of important Islamic shrines, including the tomb of Imam Abu Hanifa, founder of the Hanafi school of law followed by the Ottomans. Over the next 2 decades, Suleiman launched 2 more campaigns against Persia. Though Shah Tahmasp often avoided direct battle, using scorched earth strategies, Suleiman managed to secure key gains. By the Peace of Amasya in 1555, the Ottomans held Baghdad, western Armenia, and most of Iraq, giving them access to the Persian Gulf and firm control over Mesopotamia. This long rivalry with the Safavids was not just about borders. It was a battle for supremacy in the Islamic world, one that Suleiman would not lose. Suleiman's ambition was not limited to land. As the Ottoman Empire expanded across continents, the sea became just as crucial as the battlefield. Under his rule, the Ottoman navy transformed into a mighty force, challenging European powers and protecting vital trade routes from the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean and the heart of the Mediterranean. In the early 1500s, the Portuguese had carved out a dominant naval presence in the Indian Ocean. Suleiman viewed this as a direct threat to Ottoman influence and Islamic commerce. In response, he sent admirals like Hadim Suleiman Pasha and the skilled Saidi Ali Rise to confront Portuguese fleets and build ties with distant Muslim allies, including the Mughal Empire in India. From ports like Aden and Basra, Ottoman ships sailed to Thatta, Surat, and even Sumatra. Back in the Mediterranean, the legendary Admiral Barbarossa Hayreddin Pasha helped Suleiman challenge the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V and his naval commander, Andrea Doria. The Ottomans scored a major victory at the Battle of Preveza in 1538, securing control over the eastern Mediterranean for decades. Suleiman also forged an unlikely alliance with France, a Christian kingdom, to counter Habsburg power. This Franco-Ottoman partnership allowed joint operations and made Suleiman a key player in European politics. From the conquest of Tripoli to the defense of North Africa, the Ottoman fleet became a symbol of strength. Even distant sultanates like Aceh in Southeast Asia sought Suleiman's protection against the Portuguese. Under his command, the seas became an arena of empire, one where the Ottomans reigned supreme, guided by wind, ambition, and the will of a magnificent sultan. While Suleiman's armies conquered cities and his fleets ruled the seas, his most lasting legacy may not lie in battles at all, but in law. To his subjects, he was not just Suleiman the Magnificent, but Kanuni, the lawgiver. His reforms reshaped the Ottoman legal system and gave the empire a foundation of justice that would last for centuries. At the time, the empire relied on two legal traditions, Islamic Sharia law and secular sultanic law, known as canon. Previous rulers had issued various decrees, but the system was scattered and often contradictory. Suleiman took it upon himself to bring order. With the help of his chief legal scholar, Grand Mufti Ebasud Effendi, he reviewed past rulings, eliminated inconsistencies, and created a unified legal code. The result was a groundbreaking legal framework. It covered everything from taxation and property rights to criminal justice and civil disputes. Suleiman's reforms reduced the number of punishments involving mutilation or death, and introduced fixed fines for many offenses, making the law more consistent and humane. But his vision of justice went beyond the courtroom. He supported education, built religious schools known as madrases, and ensured scholars were trained to uphold the law across the empire. Under his reign, law became a force not of fear, but of fairness. Even beyond his empire, Suleiman's legal legacy became a model for future rulers. His canon system would endure long after his death, guiding the Ottoman world for more than 300 years. In this way, the Sultan who conquered cities also built a kingdom of order, one ruled not just by might, but by law. In the heart of Suleiman's empire, behind the grand walls of the Topkapi Palace, a remarkable woman rose to power, Hurrem Sultan. Known in the West as Roxolana, she was born in Ruthenia, captured in a Tatar raid and sold into slavery. But her journey would defy every expectation. From concubine to queen, she became the most influential woman in Ottoman history. Suleiman fell deeply in love with Hurrem. Their bond was unlike anything the palace had seen. In a stunning break from tradition, he made her his legal wife in 1534, something no Ottoman sultan had done in centuries. He also granted her a permanent place at court, allowing her to remain with him rather than being sent to the provinces like other mothers of heirs. Hurrem was not merely a consort, she was a political force. She advised Suleiman on state matters, corresponded with foreign rulers, and even influenced court appointments. Her signature appeared on official documents, and ambassadors reported her growing authority. She played a key role in strengthening Ottoman ties with Poland, the land of her birth. This period became known as the Sultanate of Women, an era when royal women held unprecedented influence. Hurrem's presence reshaped the balance of power within the palace, creating new traditions and new tensions. Her love story with Suleiman was also a story of ambition, strategy, and lasting change. From the harem's quiet chambers, she helped shape imperial policy and the future of her children. In loving her, Suleiman rewrote the rules of empire, and in return, she helped rule it beside him. Behind the grandeur of Suleiman's empire lay a shadow that no sultan could escape, the bitter price of succession. In the Ottoman tradition, only one son could inherit the throne, and this ruthless system often turned brother against brother. For Suleiman, it turned his own palace into a theater of heartbreak and blood. His sons were many, but only one would survive to rule. The most promising heir, Prince Mustafa, was admired for his leadership and popular among the army. But court whispers and accusations, likely influenced by Hurrem Sultan and her allies, painted him as a threat to Suleiman's rule. In 1553, during a campaign in Persia, Suleiman ordered Mustafa's execution. The young prince was strangled by palace guards as his father watched from behind a curtain. The tragedy did not end there. Another son, maimed, died young of smallpox in 1543. Cihangir, believed to be physically frail and emotionally sensitive, died shortly after Mustafa, many say from grief. Bayezid rebelled against his father and was executed in 1561, along with his 4 sons. Each loss left Suleiman more isolated, more burdened by the weight of his decision. The harem, once a place of love and laughter, became the setting for quiet suspicion and deadly plots. Only one son remained, Selim, known more for his indulgence than leadership. Yet by default and survival, he would become Suleiman's successor. The tale of Suleiman's sons is one of deep sorrow, where ambition clashed with affection, and loyalty was often repaid with death. Even the most powerful ruler could not shield his family from the cruel demands of empire. While Suleiman expanded borders and enforced justice, he also nurtured a different kind of power, the cultural brilliance of the Ottoman Golden Age. Under his patronage, art, literature, and architecture flourished like never before. The empire became not only the sword of Islam, but also its pen, brush, and chisel. At the center of this cultural bloom stood Mimar Sinan, the empire's greatest architect. Originally a military engineer, Sinan rose to fame as the chief imperial architect, designing over 300 structures across the empire. His crowning masterpiece was the Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul, built between 1550 and 1557. Its grand dome, elegant symmetry, and sprawling complex of schools, baths, and soup kitchens made it both a spiritual center and a symbol of Suleiman's reign. Beyond architecture, the palace teemed with poets, painters, and calligraphers. Suleiman himself wrote poetry under the pen name Muhibbi, or the lover. His verses reflected not only his deep feelings for Hurrem, but also his philosophical outlook on life and power. His lines became proverbs, cherished by Turks for generations. The imperial workshops, known as the Ale-i Hayarf, brought together artisans from across the empire, Muslims and Christians, Turks and Europeans, blending styles into a uniquely Ottoman identity. From miniature paintings to illuminated manuscripts, the arts reached dazzling heights. This era of beauty was no accident. Suleiman saw culture as a form of legacy, as enduring as stone and more telling than swords. In the splendor of his empire's creativity, he revealed a softer strength, one that outlived battles and echoed in domes, ink, and melody. While Suleiman was famed for military conquest, his mastery of diplomacy was equally powerful. As empires collided in the 16th century, Suleiman knew that victories were often won through strategy, alliances, and careful negotiation. Under his reign, the Ottoman Empire became a global player, not only on battlefields, but in royal courts and across secret networks of influence. One of Suleiman's most surprising moves was his alliance with France. Though Christian and Muslim powers had long been adversaries, Suleiman and King Francis I found common ground in their mutual hatred for the Habsburgs. This Franco-Ottoman alliance shocked Europe. French ships docked in Ottoman ports, and Ottoman fleets supported French interests in the Mediterranean. It was the first formal alliance between a Christian and Muslim power, and it shifted the balance of European politics. Suleiman also communicated with leaders as far as India, Somalia, and Southeast Asia. He supported Muslim rulers fighting Portuguese expansion and sent envoys to the Mughal emperor. This global vision helped project Ottoman power far beyond its borders. Behind the scenes, Suleiman's court maintained a sophisticated intelligence network. Spies, translators, and informants operated in Vienna, Venice, and even the Vatican. Ambassadors were carefully chosen and monitored, and information flowed in multiple directions. Suleiman valued knowledge as much as strength. He also used marriage, tribute, and honors to bind allies to the empire, turning enemies into dependents and rivals into vassals. In Suleiman's world, diplomacy was an art of survival, and he played the game with precision. The empire's borders were drawn not only by war, but by maps, letters, and secret hands. At the age of 72, when most rulers would have long since retreated into comfort, Suleiman mounted his horse once more. In the spring of 1566, he set out on what would become his 13th and final campaign, a determined strike against the fortress of Sejtvar in Hungary. Though his body was frail and illness had begun to weigh on him, his will remained unbroken. The empire still called for its sultan, and Suleiman answered with characteristic resolve. As the vast Ottoman army advanced through the Balkans, Suleiman led from the front, commanding the operation despite his failing health. He set up camp near the battlefield, directing his generals from a hilltop tent as the siege of Sejtvar began. The summer was brutal. Rain and heat battered the troops, and resistance from the defenders was fierce. Yet Suleiman refused to retreat. His presence alone inspired confidence, even if he no longer rode into battle. Inside the imperial tent, strategies were drawn, letters sent, and every move calculated with care. It was a campaign not only of conquest, but of symbolism, the aging lion showing that, even in twilight, his roar still echoed across Europe. Day by day, the fortress crumbled. The Sultan's commanders executed the siege with precision, pressing ever closer toward the walls of Sejtvar. Outside, the soldiers waited for victory. Inside, something more profound was unfolding, the final command of a ruler who had spent a lifetime shaping the fate of empires. The end was near, but not yet revealed. With the siege of Sejtvar concluded and the fortress fallen, the secret that had been guarded for nearly 2 months was finally made public. Suleiman the Magnificent had died. In the quiet hours of the 6th of September in the year 1566, the Sultan passed away in his campaign tent, far from the capital he had so powerfully ruled. His death was kept hidden to preserve the morale of the troops and the stability of the empire. Only when the battle was won was the truth carried back to Istanbul. His body was transported with reverence and laid to rest in a majestic mausoleum beside the Suleimani Mosque, one of the greatest architectural achievements of his reign. His organs, buried at the site of his final campaign, sanctified the land where power, sacrifice, and mortality met. Suleiman's passing marked more than the end of a life. It was the close of a golden age. Under his 46-year rule, the Ottoman Empire had flourished in every direction, militarily, legally, artistically, and spiritually. His code of laws brought justice, His patronage of architecture reshaped cities, and his poetry revealed the soul of a man often hidden behind the crown. Selim II, his only surviving son, inherited the throne. Though the empire remained vast, the guiding brilliance of Suleiman would not be easily replaced. He was more than a conqueror. He was a statesman, a poet, a reformer, and a legend. His shadow stretches long over history, golden and unbroken. Let us now turn to another remarkable figure of royal descent. Aisin Gioro Puyi was born on the 7th of February in the year 1906, at the hall of the prosperous spring within the Forbidden City in Beijing, China. How did a boy born into divine ancestry become the last emperor of one of the world's oldest civilizations? What does it mean to wear the dragon robe when you can barely speak? And what shadows linger when history names you both a monarch and a puppet? Puyi was born into the ruling Aisin Gioro clan of the Qing dynasty, a lineage that had held the throne of China since the mid-1700s. His father, Prince Chun, was a respected member of the imperial court, while his mother came from a noble Manchu family. Yet from the beginning, Puyi's life was more symbol than choice, a vessel for a fading dynasty's desperate hope. The political climate in China was unstable. Western imperialism, internal rebellions, and reformist movements had already begun to weaken Qing control. The Guangxu Emperor, a reform-minded ruler, had died without a surviving son, and the Empress Dowager Cixi, the real power behind the throne, had died just a day later. In the void that followed, court officials chose 2-year-old Puyi to ascend the throne, hoping that a child emperor would ensure a smooth transition and maintain their influence. Thus, barely able to walk or speak, Puyi became the Xuantong Emperor, the last monarch of an empire on the brink of collapse. His reign began with ceremony, but behind the golden curtains, the world was rapidly changing. At just 2 years old, Puyi was thrust into a world of ritual, expectation, and unimaginable weight. On the 2nd of December in the year 1908, he was officially enthroned as the Emperor of China, known by his era name, Xuantong, in a grand ceremony held within the Forbidden City's grandest halls. The coronation was steeped in centuries-old tradition. Puyi was dressed in golden robes embroidered with dragons and mounted upon the dragon throne, barely able to hold his posture. Courtiers bowed low, mandarins chanted blessings, and officials declared the boy to be the Son of Heaven, the living bridge between earth and the divine. Yet beneath the surface of this majesty was an air of uncertainty. The empire was crumbling, and those placing the crown upon his head knew it. The Empress Dowager Long Yu, widow of the late Emperor Guangxu, issued the decree of succession, hoping to stabilize the Qing court through a symbolic child ruler. Puyi's youth made him pliable, a figurehead that regents and advisors could control. Among them was his father, Prince Chun, who was named Prince Regent and took on the day-to-day burden of governance. Yet even in his innocence, Puyi sensed something was amiss. He later recalled the fear he felt during his coronation, surrounded by strangers, confused by chance, and overwhelmed by the sheer scale of ceremony. It was a surreal beginning for a boy too young to understand sovereignty, yet old enough to feel its isolation. In that single moment, China crowned its last emperor, a toddler cloaked in tradition, unaware that his reign marked the final chapter of a dying dynasty. Within the towering red walls of the Forbidden City, young Puyi lived not as a child, but as a ceremonial symbol. The imperial palace, once the beating heart of Chinese power, had become both his playground and his prison. Though he held the highest title in the land, his daily life was tightly controlled by strict rituals, endless protocol, and carefully arranged silences. From the moment he awoke, every action Puyi took was choreographed. He was attended by rows of eunuchs who dressed him, served him and bowed at every command, though few spoke directly to him. Meals were elaborate but lonely, often served in silence. Lessons in Confucian classics, Manchu traditions, and court etiquette were drilled into him with little joy or understanding. Despite the grandeur of his surroundings, the golden tiles, marble terraces, and ornate dragon carvings, Puyi's world was small. He had little contact with other children, and his interactions were closely monitored. His wet nurse became his emotional anchor, offering brief moments of affection in an otherwise cold and formal environment. Over time, the palace's beauty became a burden. Puyi remembered crying when forced to wear uncomfortable robes or sit for hours on the throne during hollow rituals. The Forbidden City, meant to reflect the majesty of the emperor, instead became a quiet monument to his loneliness. As the outside world changed rapidly, young Puyi remained sealed in a time capsule of fading imperial tradition. A boy raised not for life, but for legend, suspended between the past and the future, and increasingly aware of the cage he called home. By the year 1911, the world outside the Forbidden City was erupting with change. Revolutionary fervor had reached its peak as nationalists, students, and former soldiers rose up against the Qing dynasty. Modern ideas, fueled by years of frustration with imperial rule, had spread across provinces. The dynasty that once claimed the mandate of heaven was now facing its final reckoning. The Wuchang Uprising in October 1911 set off a wave of rebellion. Within weeks, multiple provinces declared independence from Qing rule. The imperial court scrambled to retain control, but it was too late. Negotiations began between the court's representatives and revolutionary leader Sun Yat-sen's supporters. On the 12th of February in the year 1912, Empress Dowager Longyu, speaking on behalf of 6-year-old Puyi, signed the instrument of abdication. It was a short document, less than 300 words, but its impact was historic. Over 2,000 years of dynastic rule came to an end. The Qing dynasty was no more. To ease the transition, the new Republic of China allowed Puyi to retain his imperial title within the Forbidden City. He would remain there as a retired emperor, cut off from politics, but allowed to live in splendor, at least for the moment. Puyi, unaware of the full meaning of what had happened, asked his wet nurse why there were firecrackers in the streets. She told him they were celebrating. He didn't know it then, but they were celebrating his fall. The boy who had once been called the Son of Heaven was now just a child in exile, living at the center of a vanished world. After the abdication, Puyi remained within the Forbidden City, but now as a figure without power. The grand titles, ceremonies, and tributes vanished, replaced by quiet routines and confused whispers. Though he was still called emperor by those around him, the world had moved on. Puyi was no longer the ruler of China. He was a relic of a bygone age, a child trapped in ceremonial silence. The agreement with the new Republican government allowed Puyi to stay in the palace with a generous stipend, a staff of eunuchs, and certain imperial privileges. But these comforts only masked the isolation. No longer a sovereign and not yet a citizen, Puyi existed in a limbo state, watched, indulged, and ignored. His daily life consisted of hollow rituals, lonely meals, and carefully controlled movements. Forbidden from exploring the outside world, Puyi grew up behind high crimson walls, increasingly detached from reality. He developed a love for clocks, Western toys, and foreign books, fascinated by what he could not touch. Inside this golden cage, Puyi's emotional world grew narrow. He formed bonds with eunuchs who often exploited their positions for influence. Tutors came and went, including foreign mentors who introduced him to modern ideas and the English language. But these glimpses of the outside world only deepened his confusion. Despite living in splendor, Puyi began to sense that he was being raised not for greatness, but for nothing at all. He was a boy emperor without a throne, a royal without a realm, learning too late that power without freedom is just another name for imprisonment. For over a decade after his abdication, Puyi remained behind the walls of the Forbidden City, a ghost of an emperor still surrounded by faded grandeur. But the illusion of sanctuary could not last forever. As China entered a period of growing instability, the uneasy arrangement between the former imperial household and the republican government began to unravel. By the early 1920s, public frustration over imperial privileges had reached a boiling point. The Forbidden City, with its lavish staff and isolated rituals, became a symbol of waste and old power. Corruption among eunuchs and infighting among palace officials only deepened public resentment. It was clear that the boy once treated like a god was now a burden to the new state. On the 5th of November in the year 1924, everything changed. A warlord named Feng Yuxiang took control of Beijing in a sudden coup. He issued an immediate order expelling Puyi and his entourage from the Forbidden City. There was no ceremony, no farewell, only finality. Puyi recalled being stunned as soldiers entered the palace grounds. In a matter of hours, he was forced to leave the only home he had ever known. He carried nothing but a few possessions and a lifetime of shattered illusions. At the age of 18, he walked through the Meridian Gate not as an emperor, but as a displaced youth with nowhere to belong. This eviction marked the end of the imperial world in every sense. For Puyi, it was a brutal awakening. The walls that once protected him were now closed behind him forever, leaving him to face a China that no longer believed in emperors. After his sudden eviction from the Forbidden City, Puyi sought refuge in the Japanese-controlled legation quarter in Beijing. From there, he soon relocated to the city of Tianjin in 1925, a coastal enclave filled with foreign diplomats, warlords, and spies. It was in this strange and divided city that Puyi began to reshape his identity, not as a sovereign, but as a political pawn. Living in the quiet grandeur of the Zhang Garden mansion, Puyi maintained a shadow court, complete with attendants, rituals, and titles. He still dressed in imperial robes and held mock ceremonies, pretending the Qing dynasty was simply in exile, not erased. But beneath the surface, he felt the sting of powerlessness and betrayal. It was during these years that Japanese agents began to cultivate a deeper relationship with him. They appealed to his sense of loss, promising restoration and glory. For a man raised to believe in divine rule, the idea of reclaiming his throne, even under foreign terms, was tempting. Japanese officers flattered him, offered protection, and fed his dreams of a Manchu revival. Meanwhile, the world outside grew more volatile. China was fractured, and Japanese ambitions in Manchuria were escalating. Puyi, increasingly isolated and desperate, saw no path back to power except through their hands. The Tianjin years were marked by quiet desperation masked in ceremony. Puyi was no longer emperor, but he was not yet free. As he drifted into Japan's orbit, he became the perfect candidate for their next grand experiment, one that would soon cast him as a puppet ruler in a land not entirely his own. In the early 1930s, Japan seized its opportunity. After orchestrating the Mukden incident in September 1931, Japanese forces invaded Manchuria, a region historically tied to the Manchu dynasty. Under the guise of protecting regional stability, they swiftly took control and began building a new state. But to give their conquest a veneer of legitimacy, they needed a figurehead. That figure was Puyi. In March 1932, the state of Manchukuo was proclaimed, and Puyi was installed as its chief executive. By 1934, he was declared Emperor of Manchukuo, adopting the reign title Kanged. On paper, it seemed like a restoration, the return of the king-emperor to his ancestral homeland. But in truth, it was a carefully constructed illusion. Every major decision was made by Japanese advisors. Puyi signed documents he did not write, spoke from scripts he did not author, and lived under constant surveillance. Even his palace in Changchun, renamed Sinking, was designed more for control than grandeur. Japanese guards monitored his movements, and microphones were placed throughout his residence. Yet Puyi clung to the dream. He wore imperial robes, held ceremonial banquets, and tried to enforce Confucian values. Despite the clear reality of his position, he believed he might one day break free of Japanese control and truly reclaim his throne. The creation of Manchukuo marked the peak of his manufactured sovereignty. It was a return to power in name only, a puppet state ruled from Tokyo, where Puyi was emperor in title but a prisoner in truth. From the outside, Puyi appeared to have reclaimed the throne. He wore ornate robes, sat upon a golden seat, and addressed his court in ceremonial fashion. But behind the carefully staged performances, it became increasingly clear. Puyi held no real authority. The so-called Emperor of Manchukuo was a monarch in name, a tool in the hands of the Japanese military machine. Japanese advisors controlled every arm of government, from foreign policy to the police. The Kwantung Army, Japan's occupying force in Manchuria, dictated decisions, rewrote laws, and suppressed dissent. Puyi's court was filled with spies who reported his words and actions. He was never allowed to speak freely with outsiders and required permission for even personal matters, including whom he could marry. Despite this, Puyi tried to maintain a sense of dignity. He signed documents in calligraphy, observed strict court etiquette, and insisted on being addressed with imperial titles. Yet each ritual felt emptier, each gesture more hollow. His requests were routinely ignored or overridden. His guards monitored his every move. Even his personal letters were censored or destroyed. The people of Manchukuo knew the truth. They called him the puppet emperor, a man whose presence legitimized an occupation. Resistance grew quietly as the realities of forced labor, cultural suppression, and political arrests made clear that this was not an independent nation, but a colony cloaked in silk. For Puyi, the illusion of power became a daily humiliation, a silent performance he could not end. Trapped in a gilded prison, he ruled over nothing, while the empire he once hoped to restore slipped even further into fiction. As World War II escalated across Asia, Manchukuo stood at the heart of Japan's imperial ambitions. Puyi remained its ceremonial head, watching helplessly as the region became a vast military base for Japanese aggression. Railroads carried troops to China, factories produced weapons, and the lives of local people were sacrificed in the name of conquest, all under the banner of an emperor who ruled only on paper. Puyi's role during the war was largely symbolic. He presided over military parades, signed proclamations prepared by others, and welcomed Japanese dignitaries. Behind the scenes, however, he became increasingly disillusioned. The brutal occupation of China, especially atrocities like the Nanjing Massacre, troubled him deeply. But surrounded by handlers and stripped of all agency, there was little he could do. As Japan's fortunes waned, the situation in Manchukuo became more desperate. Allied bombings targeted industrial sites, food shortages spread, and morale collapsed. By 1945, the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan and launched a massive invasion of Manchuria. The Kwantung Army, once thought invincible, crumbled within weeks. In the chaos, Puyi tried to flee. Japanese officers urged him to escape to Japan by plane, hoping to preserve their symbol of legitimacy. But as the Soviets closed in, his plans unraveled. At a remote airfield, dressed in disguise and carrying forged documents, he was captured by Soviet soldiers. The collapse of Manchukuo ended the illusion once and for all. The puppet state was dissolved, and Puyi, once emperor of the largest nation on earth, was now a prisoner of war, facing a future more uncertain than any throne could prepare him for. After his capture in August of 1945, Puyi was taken by Soviet forces and transported far from the lands he once ruled. No longer a figurehead or monarch, he now found himself a detainee, not in silk robes, but in plain clothes behind foreign bars. For 5 years, Puyi lived under Soviet custody, primarily in a prison camp near Khabarovsk in eastern Siberia. His treatment was stern but not cruel. Unlike the harsh labor camps many others endured, Puyi's status as a former emperor earned him relatively humane conditions. He shared quarters with other Japanese collaborators and military officials, many of whom had held powerful posts in Manchukuo. They were now all equals in captivity. Soviet interrogators questioned Puyi in detail, especially about his role in the puppet state and his knowledge of Japanese war crimes. Puyi cooperated, offering full confessions and detailed testimonies. He later described this time as both humiliating and strangely liberating, the first period in his life where he began to understand the consequences of his actions and the lies he had lived under. Stripped of ceremony, isolated from family, and forced to confront history's judgment, Puyi slowly began to change. He read Soviet literature, observed his captors with curiosity, and reflected on his years as a puppet emperor. The Russians, meanwhile, were unsure what to do with him. A trial, exile, return. In 1950, the answer came. The Soviet Union, under pressure from the new Chinese Communist government, agreed to repatriate Puyi. His next destination was not freedom, but another kind of prison, this time in the land where his story had first begun. In the year 1950, Puyi was returned to China, not as a monarch, but as a war criminal. The newly established People's Republic of China, led by Chairman Mao Zedong, welcomed him not with punishment, but with a radical plan, re-education. The once divine ruler would now be reshaped into a citizen of the communist state. Puyi was sent to the Fushun War Criminals Management Center in northeast China. The prison was unique, less a place of punishment, more an experiment in ideological reform. Instead of physical torture, inmates were subjected to intense psychological scrutiny. They were required to write self-criticisms, attend lectures on Marxism, and confess their past crimes in front of peers. At first, Puyi resisted. He clung to fragments of his imperial identity, insisted on special treatment, and struggled to accept that the world he once knew was gone. But over time, isolation, repetition, and introspection wore him down. He began to participate more honestly in the sessions, confronting the myths he had long believed. His transformation was slow but profound. By the mid-1950s, Puyi no longer saw himself as the son of heaven. He began gardening in the prison yard, helping other inmates and studying the teachings of the Communist Party. In 1959, after nearly a decade of re-education, Puyi received an official pardon from the Chinese government. He walked out of prison not as an emperor, not as a criminal, but as a man seeking redemption. For the first time in his life, he was free, not in title, but in truth. Yet reintegration would prove its own challenge. China had changed, and so in many ways had he. Following his pardon in 1959, Puyi stepped back into a world where his past titles meant nothing. No longer emperor, no longer prisoner, he was now an ordinary citizen of the People's Republic of China. With a trimmed haircut, simple clothes, and a quiet demeanor, he began his new life in Beijing, a city that had once bowed at his name but now moved forward without pause. He was given a job as a gardener at the Beijing Botanical Gardens, a humble position, but one that brought him peace. For a man who had once been surrounded by ritual and obedience, tending plants and sweeping paths offered a kind of grounding. He learned to ride public buses, wait in line, and live on a modest salary. The government monitored him closely, but allowed him surprising freedom. He met ordinary workers, made friends with teachers and clerks, and began to share his story with others. In time, he was introduced to a nurse named Lai Shuxian. They married in 1962, a quiet civil union with no titles, no fanfare, and no royal bloodlines involved. Puyi also began writing his memoirs, encouraged by party officials. The resulting book, From Emperor to Citizen, offered a detailed, if carefully edited, account of his life. It was part confession, part education, and part rehabilitation, an emperor's voice now shaped by the pen of the proletariat. Through this unexpected chapter, Puyi sought not restoration, but reconciliation. No longer trapped by power, he found meaning in humility, a quiet life that few would have imagined for China's last emperor. In his final years, Puyi lived a life that stood in sharp contrast to the throne he once occupied. As the People's Republic of China pushed forward with sweeping reforms, industrial growth, and ideological campaigns, the former emperor adapted quietly to his role as a model citizen. His transformation from monarch to gardener, from prisoner to writer, was held up as proof of the state's power to reshape even the most privileged lives. Puyi lived in a modest apartment in Beijing with his wife Lai Shuxian, blending into a society that had long moved past imperial grandeur. He stood in ration lines like everyone else, visited neighborhood clinics for health checkups, and paid his respects at party-sponsored events. Though he remained under occasional surveillance, he was generally treated with cautious acceptance, a living artifact of a vanished age. He continued writing and revising his memoirs, working with editors to make sure his story aligned with the party's values. His reflections, though softened by political oversight, revealed an elderly man genuinely wrestling with his past. He expressed regret for his collaboration with the Japanese and acknowledged the pain caused by his rule under Manchukuo. Occasionally, visitors would still recognize him, the last emperor of China, and treat him with quiet reverence. But most passed him by without notice, unaware that the man shopping for vegetables or walking slowly through a courtyard had once ruled from the dragon throne. In this quieter existence, Puyi finally tasted the freedom he had never known as a child ruler, the ability to live not as a symbol, but simply as a man. Puyi died on the 17th of October in the year 1967 at the age of 61. Once crowned as emperor, he passed away quietly in a Beijing hospital, far from the splendor of dynasties past. His legacy remains divided. Some see him as a tragic pawn, others as a willing collaborator. Yet many remember him as a man who changed from ruler to prisoner, from prisoner to citizen. What do you think about Suleiman the Magnificent? Was Suleiman a visionary ruler, the lawgiver who expanded an empire, brought justice to his people, and elevated art, architecture, and governance to legendary heights? Or was he a tragic conqueror, a man whose power cost him his sons, whose wars outpaced peace, and whose golden age was shadowed by personal loss and silent sorrow? And what about Aisin Gioro Puyi, the last emperor of China? Was Puyi a symbol of survival, a man who transformed from divine monarch to humble citizen, who lived through war, captivity, and revolution to find a quiet kind of redemption? Or was he a lost soul, a puppet in others' hands, denied agency from childhood, remembered more for the throne he lost than the life he lived? We would love to hear your thoughts. Were these rulers architects of destiny or passengers of fate? Did their reigns define their legacy, or did their final transformations tell the greater truth? History often crowns power, but it is silence, struggle, and change that reveal the soul. Let us know in the comments below. And if this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful tales from the past. Stories of courage, choice, and the quiet force behind history. Thank you so much for watching.